Hey there, my name's Gary Sims and this is Gary Explains. Now today I want to do a review of a Linux distro. That's not something I've done too much on this channel. I want to see what you guys think of this type of video. I want to look at Pop! OS. It's been turning into my kind of Linux distro of choice recently, and I thought I'd share my thoughts about it here on the channel. So if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Now, one of the problems that confront people who use Linux on a regular basis, what distro should they use? Now, if you're using a server distro, the choices are fairly obvious. You know, you've kind of got Red Hat or CentOS, Ubuntu server, and there's a few others, but there's some key ones and really they are kind of dominant. But when it comes to the desktop, there are lots and lots of different choices. In fact, a few months ago, I asked on Twitter if I was to do a video about how you switch from Windows to Linux, what distro should I use? And there was just so many answers. I was kind of just like, you know, overcome by all these different distros. Oh, you should use this one, you should use this one, you should use this one. And of course, that is one of the weaknesses of Linux. And I do cover that in my Windows versus Linux video. But over the last few years, there's been a version of Linux, a Linux distro that's been coming up called Pop! OS, and it's maintained by and supported by System 76. Now, System 76 create laptops and desktops that run Linux pre-installed. They come with Linux pre-installed, so they have an invested interest to make sure this distribution works well on their hardware, and then of course it also works on a wider range. So I've been looking at Pop! OS. It's been kind of becoming my favorite distro, as I said, and it really is quite interesting. Now, I've also, what I like about it is that it works on an x86-64 Intel or AMD processor, but it also works on the Raspberry Pi. So this gives me a chance to try out this distro on multiple architectures, and in fact it was a distro I used in my Windows versus Linux RAM usage video. Okay, so let's take a bit of a deeper dive. So Pop! OS is a Linux distribution. It kind of, its heritage is Ubuntu and then Debian before that. It's maintained, as I said, by System 76. Now, the first thing that's great about it is it will be familiar to all desktop computer users, whether you use Windows or whether you use a Mac. It will be familiar, but it's not trying to mimic Mac OS or Windows 10 or Windows 11, but you do understand, oh look, there's the taskbar, oh look, there's a menu, and it looks familiar without actually being copying, and that's really good because it's unique and distinctive, but yet also familiar. In all my testing with it, it has shown to be stable. It's not a kind of a loosely thrown together system that's going to be updated every day because there are, you know, it is actually pretty stable and they take the stability as a serious issue. So I've never had any crashes or blue screens of death or anything like that. And of course, also it has good performance and you can see the memory usage is pretty impressive. Again, please refer to my Windows versus Linux RAM usage video. And the other thing to mention is that the UI is generally pretty cohesive. You're not kind of having to dive into the command line for one thing, open some strange app for another setting, go into the settings for something else. When you come to it, you say, oh, I want to do Bluetooth, I want to do the network, I want to look at the display, I want to change the background. It's all pretty obvious where everything is. And from my general usage, most tasks are there in the UI where you'd expect to find them. And that's a real plus point for Pop! OS. Now, of course, as a Linux distribution on the desktop, you've got everything you'd expect as a windowing environment. You've got access to all the kind of standard apps that you would want. Firefox, for example, is there on the taskbar when you install it. And I'll talk more about the type of apps that it supports in a moment. So besides the general desktop thing, there are three features that do stand out that make Pop! OS very interesting. The first is workspaces. Now, this is not something new. This has existed on Mac OS and on Windows and on Linux for many, many years, but their integration of workspaces directly into the desktop, and it's really easy to use, is a great feature. So that basically means virtual desktops. You can have your desktop open with some windows, and then you want to do another task, you can open up a fresh desktop, and then you can have just that one window in there or two windows in there, and you can switch between them. You can move windows between the desktops, all very, very simple and very slickly implemented. A second great feature is auto tiling. So what happens is if you start up one application, when you start up another one, it automatically puts them side by side or one underneath the other. And there's great controls, including keyboard shortcuts, which we'll dive into a bit more in a moment, that allow you to rearrange the windows and change the focus. Great if you have a very big monitor and you want to have different apps coming up kind of arranged automatically without any space between them. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, but it's there if you want to use it, and it works very well. And another great feature is the Pop Store. So that's basically a software center where you can download apps and things like that. Similar thing you'd find, of course, on Windows and on Mac OS. This is generally free open source software that's available. But a good thing is, from a technical point of view, it supports both .deb files, Debian files, and Flatpak files, which means there's a greater range of different packages available, and sometimes the same package available in either format, and you can pick and choose what you want. Now, the Pop Store is also divided up into different categories. So if you're into media production, there is a category for that. If you're into productivity, there's another category for that. If you're into development, there's another category for that. And it's very easy to find the different packages that you need. Plus, there's a recommendation from Pop OS of some key applications that you might want to install that don't already come pre-installed. So overall, the workspaces, the auto tiling, and the Pop Store make it a very easy experience. Plus, as I said, that fact that it's very familiar without actually mimicking or trying to copy Windows or Mac OS. So System 76 have put a lot of thought into defining some keyboard shortcuts that are actually really useful. We're all, of course, used to Control-C, Control-V, that kind of thing. But here they've actually developed some really, really neat keyboard shortcuts that actually make using Pop OS much, much smoother experience. Let's just go through a couple of those quickly. Start with a simple one. I do this all the time on Windows. I want to leave the PC and lock the screen. On this one, they're calling it the super key. The super key is really the Windows key. It could be the super key if you've actually got a dedicated keyboard from System 76. But basically, super key and escape will lock the screen, which means you can then walk away from your workstation knowing that it is now password protected. You can move up and down through the different workspaces by using super, control, and up and down arrow, and that works really smoothly. You can close a window using super plus Q. You can maximize and minimize a window using super plus M. And then if you want to launch something quickly, like super T just quickly gives you a terminal, super B gives you the browser, and so on. So these are some great ways to actually use Pop OS with keyboard shortcuts, and you can quickly switch between the workspaces, launch a browser, switch back, very, very smooth once you get used to using them. Now, the whole point of a computer, especially one with a desktop, is to be able to do things on it. And of course, there's lots and lots of software that is supported by Linux in general, and specifically by Pop OS. So for example, you've got Firefox for the web browser, you've got Blender if you want to do that kind of thing. All of the language stuff is supported. You've got C, C++, you've got Rust, Golang, Python, the list just goes on and on. Of course, this is true of many, many Linux distributions, but I'm saying here it's brought to the front and center these different types of things that you would like to do. There's also things like Android Studio, there is the Arduino IDE, of course there is Microsoft Visual Studio Code, you've got DaVinci Resolve, you've got VLC, you've got OBS Studio. If you're into deep learning, there's TensorFlow, PyTorch, Caffe, and then of course there are things like LibreOffice, Slack, and Telegram, apps that you may find that you would want to use normally on the desktop. So what has been my overall experience? Pleasantly surprised and very encouraged is the words that I would use. I installed it on the Panther Pico PC, and I've got a video review of that here on this channel. It's only got a quad-core Celeron processor in it, but yet it was very, very smooth and very, very easy to use. And what I really liked is I also installed it on the Raspberry Pi, and the experience is almost identical. If you were just to look at it, you wouldn't know whether you were using a Raspberry Pi or whether you were using a PC. In fact, all the footage that I've shown you here during this video is recorded on a Raspberry Pi version of Pop OS. Now, the Raspberry Pi version does suffer a little from performance because the Pi processor is not as fast, of course, as what you can get in much more high-end and much more expensive, because remember the Raspberry Pi is what, $35 up to $80, $90, so it's a very, very different price bracket. But of course it works very, very well. It can lag a little bit sometimes. The biggest thing I found is there seems to be lots of I/O going on, and so it's best to install it onto an external SSD, which is what I did using USB. Change the bootloader to boot from USB, boots are absolutely fine, and that's been absolutely great. So a consistent experience across PC and the Raspberry Pi. You've got a consistent Linux distro. You've got access to all of the Linux software. So overall, definitely a thumbs up for Pop! OS, and I do recommend you check it out if you are trying to decide what Linux distro you should use. Okay, that's it. My name's Gary Sims. This is Gary Explains. What did you think of a review of the distro? Would you like to see more Linux distro reviews here on the channel? If you would, please let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel. If you like these kind of videos, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget you can follow me on Twitter at Gary Explains. And I also have a monthly newsletter. Go over to GaryExplains.com, type in your email address, no spam, just the newsletter. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.